The situation was similar in the case of children's sex. It is often said that the classical period, the 1700s, consigned it to an obscurity from which it scarcely emerged before the three essays or the beneficent anxieties of little hands. It is true that a long-standing freedom of language between children and adults, or pupils and teachers, may have disappeared. No 17th century pedagogue would have publicly advised his pupil, as did Erasmus in his dialogues, on the choice of a good prostitute. In the boisterous laughter that had accompanied the precocious sexuality of children for so long, and in all social classes it seems, was gradually stifled. But this was not a plain and simple imposition of silence, rather it was a new regime of discourses. Not any less was said about it, on the contrary, but things were said in a different way. It was different people who said them, from different points of view, and in order to obtain different results. Silence itself, the things one declines to say, or is forbidden to name, the discretion that is required between different speakers, is less the absolute limit of discourse, the other side from which it is separated by a strict boundary, than an element that functions alongside the things said, with them and in relation to them, within overall strategies. There is no binary division to be made between what one says and what one does not say. We must try to determine the different ways of not saying such things, how those who can and those who cannot speak of them are distributed, which type of discourse is authorized, or which form of discretion is required in either case. There is not one but many silences, and they are an integral part of the strategies that underlie and permeate discourses. Take the secondary schools of the 18th century, of the 1700s, for example. On the whole, one can have the impression that sex was hardly spoken of at all in these institutions, but one only has to glance over the architectural layout, the rules of discipline, and their whole internal organization. The question of sex was a constant preoccupation. The builders considered it explicitly. The organizers took it permanently into account. All who held a mixture of authority were placed in a state of perpetual alert, which the fixtures, the precautions taken, the interplay of punishments and responsibilities never ceased to reiterate. The space for classes, the shape of the tables, the planning of the recreation lessons, the distribution of the dormitories, with or without partitions, with or without curtains, the rules for monitoring bedtime and sleep periods, all this referred, in the most prolix manner, to the sexuality of children. What one might call the internal discourse of the institution, the one it employed to address itself, and which circulated among those who made it function, was largely based on the assumption that this sexuality existed, that it was precocious, alive, and ever present. But this was not all. The sex of the schoolboy became, in the course of the 18th century, of the 1700s, and quite apart from that of adolescence in general, a public problem. Doctors counseled the directors and professors of educational establishments, but they also gave their opinions to families. Educators designed projects which they submitted to the authorities. Schoolmasters turned to students, made recommendations to them, and drafted for their benefit books of exhortation, full of moral and medical examples. Around the schoolboy and his sex, there proliferated a whole literature of precepts, opinions, observations, medical advice, clinical cases, outlines for reform, and plans for ideal institutions. With Basedow and the German philanthropic movement, this transformation of adolescent sex into discourse grew to considerable dimensions. Salzmann even organized an experimental school which owed its exceptional character to a supervision and education of sex so well thought out that youth's universal sin would never need to be practiced there. And with all these measures taken, the child was not to be simply the mute and unconscious object of attentions prearranged between adults only. A certain reasonable, limited, canonical, and truthful discourse on sex was prescribed for him, a kind of discursive orthopedics. The great festival organized at the Philanthropium in May of 1776 can serve as a vignette in this regard, taking the form of an examination, mixed with floral games, the awarding of prizes, and a board of review. This was the first solemn communion of adolescent sex in reasonable discourse. In order to show the success of the sex education given to the students, Bestall had invited all the dignitaries that Germany could muster. Goethe was one of the few to decline the invitation. Before the assembled public, one of the professors, a certain Woke, asked the students selected questions concerning the mysteries of sex, birth, and procreation. He had them comment on engravings that depicted a pregnant woman, a couple, and a cradle. The replies were enlightened, offered without shame or embarrassment. No unseemly laughter intervened to disturb them, except from the very ranks of an adult audience more childish than the children themselves, and who Woke severely reprimanded. At the end, they all applauded these cherub-faced boys who, in front of adults, had skillfully woven the garlands of discourse and sex. It would be less than exact to say that the pedagogical institution has imposed a ponderous silence on the sex of children and adolescents. On the contrary, since the 18th century, the 1700s, it has multiplied the forms of discourse on the subject. It has established various points of implantation for sex. It has coded contents and qualified speakers. Speaking about children's sex, inducing educators, physicians, administrators, and parents to speak of it, or speaking to them about it, causing children themselves to talk about it, and enclosing them in a web of discourses, which sometimes addresses them, sometimes speaks about them, or impose canonical bits of knowledge on them, or use them as a basis for constructing a science that is beyond their grasp. All this together enables us to link an intensification of the intervention of power to a multiplication of discourse. The sex of children and adolescents has become, since the 18th century, the 1700s, an important area of contention around which innumerable institutional devices and discursive strategies have been employed. It may well be true that adults and children themselves were deprived of a certain way of speaking about sex, a mode that was disallowed as being too direct, crude, or coarse. But this was only the counterpart of other discourses, and perhaps the condition necessary in order for them to function, discourses that were interlocking, hierarchized, and all highly articulated around a cluster of power relations. One could mention many other centers which, in the 18th or 19th century, the 1700s or 1800s, began to produce discourses on sex. First there was medicine, via the nervous disorders, next psychiatry, when it set out to discover the etiology of mental illnesses, focusing its gaze first on excess, then onanism, then frustration, then frauds against procreation, but especially when it annexed the whole of the sexual perversions as its own province. Criminal justice, too, which had long been concerned with sexuality, particularly in the form of heinous crimes and crimes against nature, but which, toward the middle of the 19th century, toward the middle of the 1800s, broadened its jurisdiction to include petty offenses, minor indecencies, insignificant perversions, and lastly, all those social controls cropping up at the end of the last century, at the end of the 1800s, which screened the sexuality of couples, parents, and children, dangerous and endangered adolescents, undertaking to protect, separate, and forewarn, signaling perils everywhere, awakening people's attention, calling for diagnoses, piling up reports, organizing therapies. These sites radiated discourses aimed at sex, intensifying people's awareness of it as a constant danger, and this in turn created a further incentive to talk about it. One day in 1867, a farmhand from the village of Lapcourt, who was somewhat simple-minded, employed here and then there, depending on the season, living hand to mouth from a little charity or in exchange for the worst sort of labor, sleeping in barns and stables, was turned in to the authorities. At the border of a field, he had obtained a few caresses from a little girl, just as he had done before and seen done by the village urchins round about him. For, at the edge of the wood, or in the ditch by the road leading to St. Nicholas, they would play the familiar game called curdled milk. She masturbated him. So he was pointed out by the girl's parents to the mayor of the village, reported by the mayor to the gendarmes, led by the gendarmes to the judge, who indicted him, and turned him over first to a doctor, then to two other experts who not only wrote their report but also had it published. What is the significant thing about this story? The pettiness of it all. The fact that this everyday occurrence in the life of village sexuality, these inconsequential bucolic pleasures, could become, from a certain time, the object not only of a collective intolerance, but of a judicial action, a medical intervention, a careful clinical examination, and an entire theoretical elaboration. The thing to note is that they went so far as to measure the brain span, study the facial bone structure, and inspect for possible signs of degenerescence the anatomy of this personage who up to that moment had been an integral part of village life, that they made him talk, that they questioned him concerning his thoughts, inclinations, habits, sensations, and opinions, and then, acquitting him of any crime, they decided finally to make him into a pure object of medicine and knowledge, an object to be shut away till the end of his life in the hospital at Marival, but also one to be made known to the world of learning through a detailed analysis. One can be fairly certain that during the same period the Lapcourt schoolmaster was instructing the little villagers to mind their language and not to talk about all these things aloud. But this was undoubtedly one of the conditions enabling the institutions of knowledge and power to overlay this everyday bit of theater with their solemn discourse. So it was that our society, and it was doubtless the first in history to take such measures, assembled around these timeless gestures, these barely furtive pleasures between simple-minded adults and alert children, a whole machinery for speechifying, analyzing, and investigating. Between the licentious Englishman, who earnestly recorded for his own purposes the singular episodes of his secret life, and his contemporary, this village half-wit who would give a few pennies to the little girls for favors the older ones refused him, there was without doubt a profound connection. In any case, from one extreme to the other, sex became something to say, and to say exhaustively in accordance with deployments that were varied, but all, in their own way, compelling. Whether in the form of a subtle confession in confidence, or an authoritarian interrogation, sex, be it refined or rustic, had to be put into words. A great polymorphous injunction bound the Englishman and the poor Laurinese peasant alike. As history would have it, the latter was named Joy. Since the 18th century, the 1700s, sex has not ceased to provoke a kind of generalized discursive erethism, abnormal irritability or responsiveness to stimulation. And these discourses on sex did not multiply apart from or against power, but in the very space and as the means of its exercise. Incitements to speak were orchestrated from all quarters, apparatuses everywhere for listening and recording, procedures for observing, questioning, and formulating. Sex was driven out of hiding and constrained to lead a discursive existence. From the singular imperialism that compels everyone to transform their sexuality into a perpetual discourse, to the manifold mechanisms which, in the areas of economy, pedagogy, medicine, and justice, incite, extract, distribute, and institutionalize the sexual discourse. An immense verbosity is what our civilization has required and organized. Surely no other type of society has ever accumulated, and in such a relatively short span of time, a similar quantity of discourses concerned with sex. It may well be that we talk about sex more than anything else. We set our minds to the task. We convince ourselves that we have never said enough on the subject, that, through inertia or submissiveness, we conceal from ourselves the blinding evidence, and that what is essential always eludes us, so that we must always start out once again in search of it. It is possible that where sex is concerned, the most long-winded, the most impatient of societies is our own. But as this first overview shows, we are dealing less with a discourse on sex than with a multiplicity of discourses produced by a whole series of mechanisms operating in different institutions. The Middle Ages had organized around the theme of the flesh and the practice of penance a discourse that was markedly unitary. In the course of recent centuries, this relative uniformity was broken apart, scattered, and multiplied in an explosion of distinct discursivities which took form in demography, biology, medicine, psychiatry, psychology, ethics, pedagogy, and political criticism. More precisely, the secure bond that held together the moral theology of concupiscence, lust, and the obligation of confession, equivalent to the theoretical discourse on sex and its first-person formulation, was, if not broken, at least loosened and diversified between the objectification of sex in rational discourses and the movement by which each individual was set to the task of recounting his own sex. There has occurred, since the 18th century, the 1700s, a whole series of tensions, conflicts, efforts at adjustment, and attempts at retranscription. So it is not simply in terms of a continual extension that we must speak of this discursive growth. It should be seen rather as a dispersion of centers from which discourses emanated, a diversification of their forms, and the complex deployment of the network connecting them. Rather than the uniform concern to hide sex, rather than a general prudishness of language, what distinguishes these last 3 centuries is the variety, the wide dispersion of devices that were invented for speaking about it, for having it be spoken about, for inducing it to speak of itself, for listening, recording, transcribing, and redistributing what is said about it. Around sex, a whole network of varying, specific, and coercive transpositions into discourse. Rather than a massive censorship, beginning with the verbal proprieties imposed by the Age of Reason, what was involved was regulated and polymorphous incitement to discourse. The objection will doubtless be raised that if so many stimulations and constraining mechanisms were necessary in order to speak of sex, this was because there reigned over everyone a certain fundamental prohibition. Only defined necessities, economic pressures, political requirements, were able to lift this prohibition and open a few approaches to the discourse on sex, but these were limited and carefully coded. So much talk about sex, so many insistent devices contrived for causing it to be talked about, but under strict conditions. Does this not prove that it was an object of secrecy, and more important, that there is still an attempt to keep it that way? But this often stated theme, that sex is outside of discourse and that only the removing of an obstacle, the breaking of a secret, can clear the way leading to it, is precisely what needs to be examined. Does it not partake of the injunction by which discourse is provoked? Is it not with the aim of inciting people to speak of sex that it is made to mirror, at the outer limit of every actual discourse, something akin to a secret whose discovery is imperative, a thing abusively reduced to silence, and at the same time difficult and necessary, dangerous and precious to divulge? We must not forget that by making sex into that which, above all else, had to be confessed, the Christian pastoral always presented it as the disquieting enigma, not a thing which stubbornly shows itself, but one which always hides, the insidious presence that speaks in a voice so muted and often disguised that one risks remaining deaf to it. Doubtless the secret does not reside in that basic reality in relation to which all the incitements to speak of sex are situated. Whether they try to force the secret, or whether in some obscure way they reinforce it by the manner in which they speak of it, it is a question rather of a theme that forms part of the very mechanisms of these incitements, a way of giving shape to the requirement to speak about the matter, a fable that is indispensable to the endlessly proliferating economy of the discourse on sex. What is peculiar to modern societies, in fact, is not that they consigned sex to a shadow existence, but that they dedicated themselves to speaking of it ad infinitum while exploiting it as the secret.